Good Monday morning, everyone, and welcome to First Things First. We have a lot to get to this morning, but we cannot ignore what an incredibly difficult weekend it has been for the entire country. I think we're all looking for a way this morning to express what we're feeling and what we're thinking. I personally spent the last couple of days trying to explain to my two young daughters what was happening and why. And it was hard. So this morning, before we begin the show, a few moments to try and process what we are facing and how sports ties into it. Joining me, as always, Nick Wright, Kevin Wilds, and Brian Westbrook is with us. And Brian, I'm going to start with you. What has been your reaction to what's been going on across this country?
Well, Jenna, like you and probably a lot of people across the country, I've spent these last few days obviously watching what's going on in Minnesota, what's going on with the George Floyd situation over the past weekend, the protests, the rioting, and the looting. And the only thing that continues to pop into my head is, how did we get here again? How did we get to this place where we're at once again? And I was able to run into my parents yesterday. And my mother was here in D.C. in '68 when Dr. King was assassinated. And they had riots and, marching and protests and looting. And the biggest question that she said yesterday was, how do we get here again? 52 years later, we're still dealing with a lot of the same things where we have some peaceful protests, but then we have a lot of people taking advantage of the situation and rioting and looting and tearing up the stores that we all frequent, that we put our money in, that we spend time and money in. And that's scary. How do we get here again 52 years later? As a parent of 3 little black kids, we teach them a few things. One, you treat everybody right. It doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter your skin color. It doesn't matter your class. It doesn't matter your clothes. You treat everybody right. Number 2, you do the right thing. And if you see something wrong, you say something. And the last thing, and probably just as important in what's going on here, is that if I'm not around, your parents and friends are not around, your family's not around, you run to your police. They're your civil servants. They're there to protect and serve you. And just imagine, as I sit down and try to explain to my 3 little black children what's going on this weekend, the question that they've given to me. They've asked, well, if we see something, we're supposed to say something. Why was it that 3 white officers or 3 officers were standing around watching as George Floyd was murdered in the streets? Why is that true, Dad? Why is it true that if we're supposed to run to the police in the time of need, that the police officer, Derek Chauvin, was kneeling on George Floyd for nearly 10 minutes in the streets? Why? How do those things align? And truthfully, I honestly don't have any answers for them. I have to tell them that there are some good people in the world and there are some bad people. Some of the good people in the world are like the officers in Miami, that they greeted the protesters this past weekend on a knee just to show some solidarity with them, that they feel the same pain that we feel. Like the sheriff in Flint, Michigan, Chris Swanson, that said, I'm going to put my baton down. I'm going to take my helmet off and I'm going to walk with you, the protesters. Some of the brothers like LeBron James and Steph Curry, Jaylen Brown, who drove 15 miles to Atlanta to join the protesters. We need that. That's important. There are good people in this world. Then there are other brothers that don't look like me, like Carson Wentz and Zach Ertz and Joe Burrow, that have come out and said, listen, we haven't been through some of the experiences that you guys have been through. However, we're here for you. It just reminds me of when Chris Long put his hand down on Malcolm Jenkins' shoulder as he knelt in silent protest of the flag years ago. He was saying, brother, I haven't been through some of the same things that you have been through, but I'm here with you. And that's meaningful. That's what we need for the change. That's going to help us not to get to the place we're at here again in the future. Nick, as I wrap up here, I just have to ask, where will we be at as a country if our country clamored for the end of racism, the end of police brutality, the same way we're clamoring for the return of hockey and football and baseball and basketball? We all want it back after a couple months of the quarantine. Just imagine the end of police brutality and racism after many, many years of those things going on. If we all clamor for the end of those things, the way that we're clamoring for our sports to return, we won't be here again in any time in the near future.
Well, Brian, thank you for sharing that part with your family, with us. And the question you asked, unfortunately, would appear for many, many of our fellow Americans, they are much more bothered by the lack of sports than the presence of racism or the presence of police brutality. But before I get into my thoughts in full on this, Steven Jackson is a friend of this show, but longer than he's been a friend of this show, he has been a good friend of Kevin Wilde's. He's known us longer. He's known Steven longer than any of us have. And obviously, Steven's very close to this story, knowing George Floyd so well. So, Kevin, I want to kick it to you before I give my thoughts.
Sure. Well, thank you, Brian, and thank you, Nick. I thought, as I looked at the events of this weekend and last week, I thought America is lucky to have Steven Jackson. And in his call for justice and change, he's been blunt and nuanced and strong and sincere and passionate and profound. And he's been a beacon for the country and world while also grieving the loss of his friend, George Floyd, who he called twin. And this is what Steven wrote on IG in response to a message that he received. It's not about nothing else but what's wrong, what's right. Wrong is wrong, and I'm glad the world knows I'm standing for unity and us all. And I'm standing for my twin, my kids, your kids, and your kids' kids. Love to all who have love for all, which is how he signs a lot of his IGs. You know, in his playing career, he was always known as the ultimate teammate, from San Antonio to Indiana to the Bay Area. And now the qualities that made him the ultimate teammate, leadership, passion, sacrifice, and loyalty, are all on display for the world to see. Here's another quote from Steven. It's time for us to stand together, and I need you all to stand with me and to stand with me in the right way. So I wanted to say thank you to Stack. He's honored his friend. He has been a personal inspiration and inspiration to this entire country, and he continues to be the ultimate teammate, Nick.
I echo that 1,000%, Wilds, and I really appreciate you sharing that with the audience. A lot of our sports leagues, a lot of our companies, a lot of our brands released statements this weekend. And there were two things that were eerily missing from the vast majority of them: police brutality and white people. And so that's what I'm going to spend my time talking about. We're going to start with police brutality, because words matter and movements matter. And it is important not to put a nebulous label of systemic racism or injustice on the movement that we're in right now, the movement that Colin Kaepernick was a part of when he was taking a knee. It was not systemic racism that killed George Floyd. It was an officer's knee to his neck for 9 minutes that killed George Floyd. It was police brutality that killed George Floyd, and those words matter. And it is important that we call out what it is, and we call out what we are all seeing. We all saw on live television over the last 96 hours, at every nook and cranny of the country, we saw good actions by some police forces, as Brian mentioned, and we also saw an old man waiting for the bus in Salt Lake City get shoved to the ground. We saw a young college couple on their way home from a date get tased and beat up on camera for no reason other than the officers thought they could. We saw in Minneapolis people standing on their front porch on a vacant street be tear gassed. About 12 hours after, we saw a CNN reporter be arrested on scene for trying to comply with what the officers were saying. That is police brutality, and that is what has brought us to this moment. And I understand the easy thing to say is the old "a few bad apples" cliche. And to steal a line from the wise man Chris Rock, or to paraphrase him, we got to start treating our cops a lot more like we treat our airline pilots. Can't have bad apples. And the ones that we do have must be rooted out immediately, instead of, as it would appear to be the case and has been the case for far too long, protected. We must find a way to incentivize the good cops to be able to tell on the bad cops instead of furthering this thin blue line of silence that has not only gotten us to this point, but gotten certain bad apples in certain police forces to a sense of feeling so much impunity that knowing they're on camera, they will shoot rubber bullets at people standing away, holding up signs, or tear gas the press, or knowing they're on camera, stay kneeling on a man's neck for the better part of 10 minutes while he begs for his life. So that's the police brutality part of it. And now to the white people part of it. Listen to my fellow white people. For as long as we have been a country, black people have begged us to listen, that they are treated a different way by the police. And for the better part of 400 years, or since black folks have pseudo had their freedom the last 160 years, for the better part of the last 150, we've ignored them because there wasn't proof, there wasn't evidence. And then every single American got one of these. And we saw not only were our black brothers and sisters not lying to us, they hadn't even